would like a handout as well, you can go to bookoflifebuzz.com. You'll find the handout right there in the first column, and you can follow along as well. So with that, we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We've just gone through a whole lot of what exactly this ministry of the gospel is, what this ministry of reconciliation is, why it's so important, why they are risking their lives to do it. And now we go on to a topic that had come up previously in 1 Corinthians. They were talking about taking a collection for the saints in Jerusalem. And so the idea was that in Jerusalem they were in the middle of famine, lots of poverty, because you have to bear in mind, Jerusalem, that's where all the Jews lived, a lot of the Jews rather. Can't say all, obviously, but a lot of Jews lived there, and a lot of them did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And so there's a rift that happens. The people that are following the way, as they're now calling it, they're not exactly appreciated by a lot of the others. A lot of them were cast out, so they lose family, they lose support of a congregation, and so on top of all the poverty and all the political chaos that's already going on. So we saw in 1 Corinthians that there's going to be a collection from the various different churches that they would donate. We're talking typically monetarily, because food prices would have gone up, things like that, so that they can eat. And then that collection would be taken on to Jerusalem. And so this kind of wraps that up. So without much further discussion on that, we'll just jump right on into the first passage, and we'll break that down. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to go verses 1 through 15. He says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this is not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, and that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. So that's our starting passage there. That's going to be kind of the majority of what we're going to be discussing this morning. So we'll break that on down. We're going to hit verses 1 and 2, and we'll start over there. So he says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." So he says he wants to let them know about what's going on in Macedonia, the grace of God. The Macedonians are giving a lot of money. It's God's grace. So he says the churches in Macedonia. Now Macedonia is north of Corinth, and it's where Paul's writing from at this point. So it's really up in that whole area where the arrow is pointing there. Corinth is that kind of, I don't know, not the long little island, but the kind of blobby island to the south of that. That's where they are in Corinth. So he's talking about the churches up north there in Macedonia. And he says that they're suffering. They're suffering from tribulation, they're being persecuted and so on, as obviously a lot of others are, but again, we see that a lot. The church gets established and immediately people are outcasts, they're being persecuted, they're being, they're suffering, they're being tortured, things like that. So he says they're suffering through a lot of this stuff, and including poverty, right? The same exact kind of thing, sort of like what's going on in Jerusalem. These guys are experiencing poverty as well, maybe to a lesser extent, but they're still finding that they can't really afford stuff. They've lost support systems and family members and so on, where they're no longer welcome. He says that poverty, that tribulation, he says it overflowed into a wealth of generosity, which is a really neat thing to see. These people, they're in poverty, they're needy themselves, and what are they doing? They're taking what they have and they're still giving it. It's into wealth of generosity, and that generosity, that word there, is sincerity and openness. They're being open. They're doing what God is calling them to do. So the question is, what does that look like? They're already, in poverty, and then they're giving. They've got this overflow, this tribulation, this poverty has overflowed into something else that's provoked them to sincerity and openness. It looks like verses 3 through 5. He says, "For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us." If there's a verse to circle and to kind of keep in mind throughout the week, I think it's that, verses 3 through 5. That gives us this really, really neat thing that's going on. The churches, he starts off, he says, they gave according to their means, which is what you would expect. What does it mean to give according to your means? I give what I have to give. You're not taking like the credit card and racking up fees and donating off of the credit card and borrowing later, right? We take of what I've got and I give it. So that makes sense. He says they gave of their means and beyond. First, of their own accord. I'm going to pull that joke every single time. Sorry. It's a Honda Accord. No, according to their own accord, their own idea. It was they're planning together saying, hey, this is how we're going to give. They weren't being told, you have to give this amount, right? Which is one of those things, because it's kind of funny. We almost like want that, right? Yeah, people ask pastors all the time, how much should I give? And they're looking for the 10%. Yeah, no, that's the law. It's not that easy. You have to give according to the way God purposes in your heart, of one accord. So he's saying they didn't command them, you give this money. They didn't command them amount. He says this is their own doing between them and the Lord. And they gave from their own need. That's where the Lord brought them. What does that mean, giving from their own need? Right? That means I have things that I need, right? Maybe I've got a set number of meals, and that's all I've got. I've got no way of getting more meals until next week. And then I give somebody my dinner tonight. What does that mean for me? I'm not having dinner tonight. That's what that means. That's what they were doing, right? They gave out of their own means, everything they had. Not like they were now starving themselves, but, I mean, let's face it, most of us can go without a meal from time to time if it helps somebody, right? We're not really used to that sort of a position because here in America, it's pretty rare that you're going to end up going without a meal unless you really want to. But that's what they were doing. They're giving out of their own means. And this isn't the first time we see this. This has actually been modeled for us previously if we're paying attention. Mark 12, 41 through 44 is the widow and the mites. It says, and Jesus sat down opposite the treasury, and he watched the people putting money into an offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. And so we see the same exact kind of principle there, right? Because it's easy to, when we have excess, like, oh, sure, I can give all kinds of excess. I don't need that money anyway, not a big deal. But when it's out of our need, and I'm not saying, by the way, that this is a model for giving. Because I think that would be a bad model for giving. If we're constantly giving like what we need, we're going to have some trouble, right? But would the Lord lead you to give something that you really can't afford to give? Right? Because he could. Right? Something that you need, that you normally use, but somebody else really, really needs that, and you could do without. Will you do that? Because that's what she did. She trusted that God was going to provide. We see that modeled right here. He makes it a little bit harder. And so that's what the Macedonians were doing. They were listening to God, and God said, okay, you're going to do something real difficult here. It's going to be tough on you, but worth it. Find my spot here. Okay, so they do this, and Paul says they're begging for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. So not only are they giving the things that they have that they actually need to help the saints, but they're begging for the opportunity to do so. Please don't convince us otherwise. I know we need this, but we want to be part of this. We want to give to the saints. Why? Isn't that weird? You imagine? Like somebody's taking an offering and you don't really have anything to give, and so you give out of what you need because you just want to, you have to. Please don't convince me otherwise. That's what they were doing. Why would they do that? Well, it's fundamental to God's own being, by the way. Let's take a look, because this brought to mind something that happened in Matthew 20. Is the verse I've got here. Now, the mother of the sons of Zebedee had approached Jesus, and she's basically asking him, hey, my two boys here, they're pretty cool, right? What do you say you put one on your right hand, one on your left in your kingdom of heaven? Make these guys like top of the kingdom, right? They're like, you're still Jesus and all, but these guys rank right next to you. What do you think about that? And Jesus, because he's so amazing and patient with us, takes an opportunity to teach us something about that. And so I pick it up here in verse 25. He says, but Jesus called them to him, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This will come into play here shortly. So this kingdom of heaven thing works completely different. The idea is you don't get this rank by making accomplishments, you serve, like Jesus did. He came to serve us. He came to save us. That was his whole purpose. You don't find Jesus doing a whole lot of things that, was a good idea to him that would help him. He's serving. That's why he's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, by the way. You can't outserve Jesus. He was perfect. But boy, should we try. That should be our goal. That's how to be great in the kingdom of heaven. And so they're sort of doing that, right, by giving out of their need. Yeah, they could have a meal, but these people over in Jerusalem, man, they might be dying. Maybe they can give something up. And they were happy to do that. Why? Well, he says right here, like, good things happen, right? It's an amazing place to be in the kingdom of heaven. How much more if you actually suffered for people here, if you served people here like Jesus did. And so they get the opportunity to do that. And so they're begging, please let us do that, right? That's the whole point. So I think they really got that, even though I don't think they had Matthew to read through at the time. I'm sure the story was told. So they gave, and they gave more than Paul and all them expected. Because bear in mind, like, they're going through collecting. They know these guys are in poverty as well. They're probably not expecting to take in a whole lot. Most of these people are just barely getting by. How much can they afford to give? And so they take a look and they're like, wow, that's way more than we expected was going on here. And of course, Paul is bringing this up because this is all glory to God. This is God's grace that he's arranged for this. So they gave more than they expected. Now, how did they do it? And this is key to those verses I was saying, 3 through 5. They did it by submitting all that they had first to God. Right? They're not sitting there thinking, well, I can do without this, I can do without that. They're saying, all that I have belongs to God. It's all God's. Here you go, Lord. And then they give for the relief. That's the approach that we should be taking. My paycheck comes in. I'm not sitting there saying, okay, I'm going to take this cut here and that's for God. It's the other way around. Here you go, Lord. And that's why we can't give you the 10% number. It's not a bad thing to start if you're not really too sure. If you're not really sure what God wants from you, it's better than nothing, right? But you got to figure that number out. It could be higher, it could be lower, it could be anything, right? He called these guys to give out of their need. So it's between you and God. And the idea is you take everything you own. It's all his anyway. He gave it to me. It belongs to him. Now what is he going to do? I'll tell you, probably one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to make sure you pay your mortgage. He's going to make sure you make due on, all your obligations and stuff, because that's just generally what we would expect. We're not going to expect that God's going to tell you, well, sorry, you're going to have to skip your mortgage payment this week, right? Be reasonable, but be in prayer. Give it to him and see what he does with it. He might take a little bit, he might take a lot. It's all his anyway, right? And so that's kind of the principle that they were working on, is they weren't sitting there thinking, oh, Paul is excited, maybe we should give more than we really should. They're saying, no, this belongs to the Lord. Let's see what he does. And he did something pretty amazing. Accordingly, we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. So they're encouraged by the churches in Macedonia. And so they sent Titus to finish collecting for the from the Corinthians, as they had intended previously, as we'd read. And so the idea is they'd been collecting, and now Titus is going to come through and kind of wrap this whole thing on up. So maybe, it kind of tapered off as they're regularly collecting. Now it's kind of, ramp it up. Let's get this stuff together, and now it's going to be collected and brought in. And so he brings up the Macedonians to kind of encourage them. Hey, we're about to complete this really good thing, this act of grace from God. And just wanted to let you know how things went up north, and it's amazing, and look what God did. So he's encouraging them. That's why he's telling them that. He says, but as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. Now, it's kind of funny. You notice Paul doesn't usually avoid the opportunity to lift them up, right? To draw attention to their qualities. He's talking about all the time how he boasts in them and so on. And so we see him doing that here. Like, you've got all these amazing qualities. This should be among them, right? Finish this act of grace. What's funny is I ran into, I can't even remember what commentary it was. It might have been something random where they say, yeah, here's Paul being sarcastic. Like, sarcastic? What letter are you in? This isn't 1 Corinthians, right? They had corrected all the problems that they were having. And so it's not sarcastic for him to say, you've got great faith, great knowledge, and all this. No, he was lifting them up. So they have great faith. They're believing in the gospel. And again, all obvious because they accepted it. They took the correction. Great speech, which was pretty typical of these guys anyway. They were real big on, giving speeches and instructing people and teaching and so on. They were good at that, and much more so in the church. They have great knowledge. They've got the truth. What more can you have? Great earnestness, which is quickness to obedience. It's obeying, right? And so, for example, when they receive 1 Corinthians and they're told, hey, you got this stuff all messed up, what do? They, boom, done. We're sorry. We're repentant, right? They were earnest about it. He says you have love. Now, what's interesting is if you have a King James that says that your love for us, but if you have something like ESV, it'll say our love for you. And so I was like, well, why is that different? That's strange. And so I looked it up, and it's because the connecting word, like for us or for you, it's the same word. It could mean either one. And so ESV, they translate it to, your love, our love for you is what one of their qualities is. I disagree. I don't think that's probably what he meant. I think he probably meant the other way around, their love for him, because he's talking about their qualities, right? But that's neither here nor there. That's just what it is. And so he says, see to it that you excel in this act of grace also. He's saying this is another godly quality. This is really important. So you guys hold up faith and knowledge and speech and all that to be these important things in the Corinthian church, finishing up this act of grace, this offering to the saints in need should be another one of those qualities. See to it. And so he says, I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. That's where that comes into play again, right? So again, he's saying they're not commanded to give. And it's important that they know that. And this isn't Paul saying, come on, you got to give something. He's not giving an amount. He's not saying you have to give. It's not a commandment. It's an encouragement. Just as the Macedonian churches demonstrated their love to be genuine by giving, that's what they would demonstrate their love to be. They have the same opportunity, right? The Macedonians are known to be strong believers in God, strong believers in Jesus because of their giving, because what regular person does that? He says, well, this is your opportunity to be known the same way. And again, of their own free will. It's not a commandment. It can't be. That's the interesting thing, right? We can't really stand up here and say, you have to give to the church, you have to tithe, because it's not in there. It's as God purposes in your heart. It removes us from the whole process. It's between you and the Lord. You should be going before the Lord and figuring that out. But he says you can't command it. Because as soon as you command it, it's not free love, right? You can't sit there and command somebody to do a love offering, to do something nice, to serve somebody. And, it's like they didn't make the decision. They're just doing what they were told. So the idea is, hey, there's this need, and we're taking up a collection. Do with that what you want. And so he gives Jesus as an example. Though he was rich, he's not talking about money here. He's talking about who Jesus is. He's God himself, member of the Trinity. There is no higher, right? He was rich. He's God, right? Yet for your sake, he became poor. And again, not talking about money here. He set aside his glory. He's God, and then he's born as man. He became human. Below the angels, right? I mean, think about that. Like the serpent in the garden and Satan doing his nonsense and rebelling against God. And what does Jesus do? He makes himself less than him. He's a human being, born in human flesh. And not born to trumpets, blasts and stuff. He was born in a manger where they feed animals and stuff. He was born into, and we say poverty, not poverty by that definition. From what I understand, his whole family was kind of a solid, maybe middle or lower middle class kind of thing. It's not like they were poor and going hungry. But, I don't know, compared to your life, I got, air conditioning and heating and a car, right? But the point is, he became a human being. He was no longer God. Obviously both but we're not going to get nitpicky there. He made himself lower. He was rich, and now he's poor. And he says, he did that so that by his poverty, you might become rich. And again, I'm not talking about money, so what are we talking about? Well, we've been discussing this for a while, right? We've been talking about the resurrection body, eternity in the kingdom of heaven as God's children. You didn't have that before Jesus. No hope before him. You certainly couldn't obtain any of that. It's because he made himself poor that you could be rich. Again, sacrifice. That's why that was so important to him. That's why he made it a point to say, that widow over there, do you see what she's doing? That's a godly thing. That's what Jesus is doing. He's not up there in heaven saying, here I am, I'm God, and I'm going to save mankind. No, he became poor so that we could have that. And so that's a big deal. One other thing made me kind of think. This act of humility, this death, he gave himself for us. And we're seeing that's this kind of giving, this offering that we're reading about, that the people in Macedonia were doing. They're giving of themselves. And it got me thinking, when Jesus was washing the feet, and I didn't put the verses in here. I'm not sure why, but I didn't. But when Jesus was washing the feet and proving to the disciples, showing them, again, the same principle, right? The servants are first in the kingdom of heaven. The self-sacrificing are first in the kingdom of heaven. That's what you strive to be. He's washing their feet. And it kind of got me to thinking, we've got cartoons about it, and we kind of think, oh, that's kind of weird and stuff like that. But he was making a point. And I got to thinking, do you think that Jesus was like, come here, Peter. I'm looking forward to handling your stinky, smelly, nasty feet. That's what I want to do right now. No. I'd be willing to bet he's probably kind of smelling them like, whew, boy, Peter, you stepped in something back there, right? I don't think that he was like eager and wanting to do that. He did it. It was sacrifice on purpose. Just like he wasn't eager to get to the cross. He didn't want to go out and die, but he was willing to do it. And he did it. And so I think we draw the mistake in giving, in serving, to think that it's pleasant, right? It has to be pleasant. Because I'm telling you, those Macedonians, they're going without meals. That wasn't pleasant. Oh, but it was joyful, and it honored God, and it glorified God. And they wanted to do it because of that, not because they wanted to go hungry. And again, we live in America. You can sit there and change the thermostat inside of a building at the press of a button. We don't usually go without. But maybe part of our giving is to go without, because that's what Jesus did. That's what the widow did. Serving isn't always just of the excess. And the Macedonians didn't have much excess to give, and yet they gave beyond that. It says, and in this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness and desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. So once again, still on a command. He's not saying you have to give. He's not saying you have to give this amount. But he's giving them advice. He says, yeah, so consider this when you make your decision. Give as God will for your own good. Right? He says, I give this my judgment. This benefits you. This is a good thing. It would be wise of you. Right? And again, he's not talking dollar amounts. He's not forcing them. Because he could, right? He's an apostle. He could be like, everybody needs to give X%. But then it wouldn't be a blessing to them. The fact that they're not required is what the blessing is. So he's giving them advice. Give as God wills for your own good. And he points out they started collecting previously. And again, that's where we see that in 1 Corinthians. He's talking about this offering and so on. But the good work is in completion, not the intention alone, right? So what good is it if they start making a collection and it kind of peters out and then the saints in Jerusalem never get it? He says, no, you got to complete it. And he's kind of reminding them, like, remember, you guys were eager to start this whole thing. Let's wrap it up. And again, that's the whole point why he's saying, look what the Macedonians did. This is amazing. Don't you want to be in on that? For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. So he's making the point. Macedonians did this thing like they gave above and beyond. Maybe that's not what God's calling for the Corinthians. He says, give out of your need. That's all. Give out of what you have as God wills. And what they have is given by God anyway. Again, back to that same principle. You give it to God first, and then see what he does with it. Maybe he gives a lot, maybe not so much. And he's pointing out, this is a basic principle in fairness. And again, talking about giving out of what they have. And the point is to not burden them in order to ease other people. He says, if we're not trying to be unfair, like, okay, you guys take all of your excess and now you're living in poverty so that these guys don't have to live in poverty. He's not saying that at all. He says, give the excess to those who are in need, who don't have excess, who have less than excess. And then when a time of need in Corinth arises, they'll be supported by other people that do have excess. Pretty basic stuff. That's really the point of benevolence in general. That's why we give to poor. That's why we give to causes and things like that. And so if you've got this excess right now, maybe it can help somebody else out. And then maybe, if I find myself on the other end of that, where I'm having trouble, feeding the family, maybe somebody with excess will help me do that. And then he gives something that's really kind of interesting. He quotes in verse 15. He says, as it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. I'm sitting there thinking, what is that? Well, that's Exodus 16, verses 16 through 18. It's about manna, right? The bread from heavens, the way that God fed the people, the Israelites. It says, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, the manna, each of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. Same exact principle, and that's what Paul's talking about. He said it's like the manna, right? So they're told basically per person, everybody gets one omer of manna. Whatever an omer is, I have no idea. Don't ask me. I didn't look it up. It's like a pound or a cup or something. It's a measurement, right? He says this is the amount that's the proper manna diet for everybody here. And this is how much each person gets. No more, no less. And he sends them out. But it says, specifically, some gathered more than that, and some didn't even get the full omer worth, but yet they all had an omer to eat. As because the people that gathered too much shared the excess with the people that didn't gather enough. And that would be normal because as they're out there gathering it, granted, they're just literally picking the stuff off the plants and stuff like that. But you've got people like elderly people that can't really get down on your knees and gather that up off the ground. Not easily. You're not going to get much. You got infants. You got people who are disabled in some way. So not everybody's able to gather a full omer. So it makes sense. Some of them came up short. They didn't get that much. And the ones that were healthy and young and able to keep gathering more shared what they had excess. Right? Same exact principle here with benevolence, with giving. Right? Taking up collections and stuff. Is that you find yourself on the other end of that, the collections will be made for you. It's God's family. It's God's church worldwide. And that's how that's supposed to work. And that's based off of that principle. And so with that, he wraps up with a commendation of Titus, kind of logistics behind the offering and so on. And so we'll jump into that. That doesn't take a whole lot of time here. He says, but thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he's going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. Not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of men. And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of this great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. Right? Isn't that how we know that people are believers, is for the love that you have for one another? And he's saying this is an outward example of that, and it proves that you're believers. I'll start at the beginning of the passage. He says, "But thanks be to God, who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he's going to you of his own accord." So he's saying Titus is going to manage this, he's going to facilitate this, not Paul. And he says Titus was very quick to accept this call, right? Obviously, Paul had to ask him, hey, will you go and manage this thing? But he says that Titus was more than happy to, right? He did it of his own will, not just because he was asked, right? Because again, Paul could pull the authority card and be like, Titus, you do this now. And Titus is like, oh, okay, I don't really want to. No, Titus was like, I thought you'd never ask. He's excited to. And the purpose, what's interesting, he says, we put it into the heart of Titus, the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest is going to you of his own accord. Thanks be to God. So the idea of this is that it's a blessing to the Corinthians that Titus is going, right? Titus loves them the way Paul does, right? He's got the same heart for the Corinthians that Paul does. And so it's a blessing for him to go and facilitate this. Because again, they can take up collections and stuff, but who's going to bring it down to Jerusalem? Who's going to facilitate the actual collectioning and giving? And so Titus is being sent to that as a blessing to the Corinthians. He says, with him we are sending the brother, who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. Not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. So first off, he says there's a brother that's also going to be sent with him, with Titus, and he's going to help in gathering the collection. So then everybody's question is, well, who's the brother, right? We're talking brother is going to be a believer. So who is that that's traveling with him? And apparently the roughly general consensus is that it was probably Luke. And the reason they suggest that is that we already know that Luke was traveling with them. He wrote Acts, and you can see he very clearly denotes like when he's with them and when he's not, because he'll say we in certain chapters, and then he'll say they in other chapters as he narrates through Acts. And so you can kind of get an idea when Luke was with them and when he's just telling of other things that he heard happen. And so that's a big part of that. And there's the general idea is that if the church itself assigned him, that it probably would have been Luke. Also, Luke, of course, wrote the Gospel of Luke, and so I guess, again, the thought is if we're talking about this well-known preacher, well, Luke wrote an entire Gospel, wouldn't it make sense that he's preaching that maybe even before he wrote it all down? And so that's kind of the idea there. And do I know that for sure? Absolutely not. It doesn't say Luke, so I don't know. Sounds good to me. Lots of people believe that to be the case. Nothing wrong with that. Don't take it as doctrine, that's all. But he was appointed by the church to go with them for the glory of the Lord. So this is somebody very trustworthy, somebody who represents the Lord very well, who people know. And so for Jesus' glory, he was assigned to them to help and to show their goodwill. Again, the whole purpose is to demonstrate love. And he's a preacher, which is pretty useful, right? Because then he gets to give them the context, right? There's nothing better than a good, benevolence, like the Macedonians are doing, like they're giving out of their need. Well, you got to frame that in context. Why are they doing that? And a preacher will say, that's why they're doing that. Look at what Jesus did. Look at God in this. And so they've got a preacher going around explaining this love, this outward love is of God. So it makes sense, whether it's Luke or somebody else, that they've got a preacher along with them. So he says, we take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. So they're careful to have well-trusted people managing the money. Paul's purposely kind of keeping distant so it doesn't affect his ministry, that money is being managed in a nice, transparent way, that people who are reliable are doing it. And the idea is to prevent false accusations against Paul and against the ministry itself. Right? The idea is somebody else can manage this, where that's their job, that's what they're good at, and they can be transparent, they can make sure to show that there's no shenanigans going on, and that way nobody can sit there and say, oh, look at Paul, he's probably embezzling money or something. Well, they can't say that because he's not even handling it. And so it's a pretty wise thing to do. He says, for we aim at what is honorable. Talking about transparency, really. The King James Version renders that they are providing for honest things, which isn't really terribly useful if you're not familiar with the phrase, because it was a maxim at the time. It's a saying. And the saying meant plan for honesty and transparency ahead of time. So there's being honest and transparent, like in the moment. What I'm doing, okay, I think I'll do this to make sure that you know that, nothing up my sleeve kind of a thing. But the phrase the providing for honest things means I'm going to think ahead of time. Before I do all this, what can I do to be transparent? What could be the possible false accusations that could come against me, and how can I prevent those from happening? And so Paul's like going all out. He's like, this has to be bulletproof, that nobody could sit there and say that this act of grace is something negative. And so he's planning for that and putting the right people in place, that's all. And again, he specifies not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man, and that's where this goes along. Lord's sight is easy, right? They got an honorable heart. They're purposely giving out of love. That's the Lord's sight. God knows your heart. Man, we tend to accuse stuff, right? Oh, yeah, they say they're giving, but, somebody's embezzling or doing this inappropriate or that inappropriate. And so that's really kind of what he's aiming at. It needs to be honest and open and transparent, not just for God, but for even crazy man, right? No room for false accusation, providing for honest things. He says, and with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. So in this case, again, we're saying a brother is sent with them as well. And again, not named. But what we know of him is that he's been proven earnest or diligent, quick to respond and do the right godly thing, right? And how has he been proven? He's been tested. He's been in situations where diligence is the correct answer, and that's what he did. He didn't dawdle around, I'll pray about it more, we'll see. No, he figured it out and he did it. Whatever that was. So they had proof of it. He'd been tested. And not only was he diligent and proven himself to be a godly man, he says he has great confidence in the Corinthians, which makes him even more, he's excited to go, right? It's like, look at these guys. They're doing some amazing things. They're responding to the gospel properly. He's got confidence in them. It's like he knows that these are believers, and he's excited to be involved. So same question as before. Well, who is this brother? No idea. In general, nobody really has any idea. It's just unnamed. We don't know. Maybe it's a name that we find somewhere else. Maybe it's somebody completely different. We don't know. But the importance is that he was proven reliable and he was confident in Corinth. And that was yet another person going along for this collection to make sure that it's done right. That's all. He says, as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So he starts to wrap up here, and he's kind of reminding them, these are the roles. When you're talking to people, and they're like, well, who are you? This is who they are. Titus is traveling as Paul's partner. He's his fellow worker of the ministry and the gospel of reconciliation. He's basically the head honcho out there with these guys. He's the one in charge. Paul's partner, right? You want to know what's going on with Paul? This is like his guy, his number one guy. That's who Titus is. Which is good, because what's Paul charged with? The gospel of reconciliation. So that's pretty good, pretty important. That's what Titus is there for. The brothers, they're traveling as messengers of the churches, representatives. They represent the churches. Each and every one that's going along, they're a representative of the church. They say something, you take it as from the church, which is good to know if they're one of those guys going there, because they don't want to be like just running their mouth saying stuff willy-nilly. They need to be saying stuff that the church agrees with, that Jesus agrees with. They're representatives, and they're conducting themselves on behalf of the churches. They're messengers of the churches, and therefore the glory of Christ, because what's the church all about? Who's the head of the church? It's Jesus. And so they're speaking for Jesus. That's who they are. They're representatives. They're shown faithful, they're dedicated, and they're conducting the will of Jesus. They're Christians, right? That's all of us, really. And so that's the role of these people as they go out. They're Jesus to the rest of the world, particularly the unbelievers. He says, so give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. And so he wraps up chapter 18. This actually kind of kicks off chapter 9, so we'll probably reread it next week. Paul encourages them to give what they have first to God, and then to the collection as God wills, something they need to work out with the Lord. And by doing that, it proves their love to the churches. It says, give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. Because remember, Paul's going around, he's building these guys up. He's not just saying nice things willy-nilly to flatter them, but he's taking different qualities that they have as believers in Jesus, and he's telling people about them. He's like, these Corinthians, you got to meet them. They do this for the Lord. They glorify God like this. And so by finishing up this collection and doing it God's way, not their way, they show that the church of Corinth knows love because they know Jesus. And they also show, yeah, Paul told you, right? He knows what he's talking about. Shows them as believers. So a year ago, Corinth set out to take a collection for the poor in Jerusalem, specifically the poor saints, the poor believers in Jesus. And now they're being encouraged to finish the collection as an act of love, right? So it's time to kind of finish that up, wrap that up. Delegates are going to be sent to take the collection. And again, he says several times, this is not a commandment. It can't be. It's not an act of love, it's a commandment. He says, you must give this amount, an act of obedience, but not love. You have to do it willingly. And he encourages them by the encouragement from the churches in Macedonia, who gave more than expected, right? This is not just like this business thing. He says, there's blessing here. Look at what happened. And he gives that as a way to encourage the Corinthians, that maybe they think, oh, wow, look at what God did there. I can't wait to see what he does here. And that they're diligent about it. And so it's encouragement. They're encouraged that their excess can help others, while excess of others can help them in times of need. So he shows them this is how this all works out. You know, you bless others, and those other churches might bless you one day too. It's taking care of God's people. So godly and trustworthy believers are sent to facilitate and encourage the collection. They're trying to be completely open, make sure that there's no room for accusations to get through, and they're trying to demonstrate the glory and the love of God through this. Because again, it's not about the Corinthians and how much money they can raise. It's not about, that's what, it always drives me, that's like the fundraisers and stuff. Like, oh, so-and-so in such and such a place donated this amount, and we're going to match that amount, and it's like all these numbers and stuff. No. That's not at all what that's about. It's about glorifying God. It's about that maybe, just like he did with the Macedonians, Paul can talk about the Corinthians and how they gave beyond what they were expected because they love God. Because God is amazing and gave it all to them to begin with. And so all of that is to demonstrate the glory of God and demonstrate the love of Jesus who gave his life for us, who did this, he set the whole thing up, right? He serves us so that we would serve others. The best servant is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you for this text. We thank you for the demonstration of the models that you've laid forward for us serving others, not just in giving, but in serving in general. Lord, I pray that you put it on our heart that we would serve in a self-sacrificial way, above and beyond just simply excess or things that we enjoy, but Lord, that we would actually go the extent of giving it all to you and allowing you to direct us to serve in ways that we wouldn't have chosen, maybe that we wouldn't have desired, but that we would desire it because it brings you glory and honor. Lord, we just ask that you would work in our hearts and bring us through this week in that way. In Jesus' name, amen.